Uh, Besides thanking Raina for setting up this technical Zoom call, I want to thank Gary and Jeannie Edwards for running the Sorrento Sullivan Historical Society, or the Sullivan-Sorrento Historical Society, depending on which side of the bridge you live on. And I'd make a plea to all of you to please consider joining, make a individual donation or a family donation or a sustaining donation, or to donate some of your time to help them out with all their records. They've got a wonderful resource of records at the Historical Society. So I'll just get going very quickly. I've got a lot of slides here tonight. The Sorrento history has always sort of interested me since I've been coming to the town 60 years ago, before I was born. My parents bought a little plot of land 60 years ago on what is called Doane's Point, and had a little cabin put up by a local builder named Cliff Hale, who is related to Thelma White, who is another Sorrentoite that many people know. Her father, Cliff, built many houses in Sorrento along with her uncle, and ours was one of those houses. And so the background of my history of Sorrento really got me started from this map that I came across many years ago. And this is the 1927 map of Sorrento that was used in a auction of Sorrento properties in 1927. And the first thing that caught my eye about this map, you can probably see down in the bottom, this is a close-up view of Doane's Point. Doane was spelled incorrectly from what I had always learned. I wanted to know why it was spelled incorrectly there. The other funny thing about the map is it showed which properties were for sale at the time of the auction. And what it showed was our plot, which is, you can see letter L on the point, but the one right directly next door was not for sale. And that always interested me. Why were some plots already pre-sold? Who owned them? What had happened to them? The other thing that the map had was where the second arrow is up at the top, there's a little listing for a building that's no longer there. It was called the Clubhouse. And I always wondered what the Clubhouse was. And so my journey into Sorrento history sort of started from this map. I made a bunch of false moves going into this, going down some, as people do history, you always go down doors that lead you nowhere, dead ends. And I was trying to track down who this Doane was and who it was named for. But luckily, for some, I'd found some earlier history that the Historical Society had done that told me exactly who Doane was, and that was great. That was published early on when I started looking at this stuff. So it was pretty much clear to me that the wrong turn that I made was quickly corrected, and I was able to go on my way. So let me just, for those of you that aren't familiar with the local geography, most of you are though, Sorrento is on Waukeag Neck. And of course, Waukeag Neck was part of Sullivan. And this early map is from around the 1870s during the mining era of Sullivan. And it's full of familiar names. If you look closely at the map, you can see names like Bean and Preble, Bragdon, Simpson. We also see the islands off of Sorrento, including Bean Island, Dram Island, Preble, which was once known as Simpson's Island, Calf Island, and around the back on the end of Doane's Point, you see what is referred to as Soward's Island, which today is Treasure Island.
Well, that's the one we
So I'd just like to focus my presentation on Doane's Point and the establishment of Sorrento as a summer resort. But, you know, for everybody here, this land was settled long ago by the Wabanaki people, hence the name Waukeag. If you're interested, I have a posting on my blog about the early derivations of the name Waukeag, how it came into being. And then the people that came after them, the early settlers from the Revolutionary time who received land grants from the state of Massachusetts. They established saltwater farms. They fished in the sea. They got involved in other industries, the timber industry primarily. And then later on, more importantly, they got involved in other activities in town, other industries, quarrying, but more importantly, mining. And mining plays a huge part in Sullivan's history. And there's a very close relationship between the mining history and the establishment of Sorrento that I'll explain a little bit. If you're interested in some of that history, I've also done some pieces on the mining industry in Sullivan so far. But eventually, after after the saltwater farms and the mining industry, Maine started to develop another industry, and that was tourism and summer resorts. And by 1886, the resort of Sorrento had been established. And very early on in Sorrento history, a large 3-story cottage with a square balconied turret was built on the hill above Doane's Point, overlooking Flanders Bay and Calf Island. And this home was among the very first constructed in the early years of the development. When I was a kid, our house was just below the hill where it was located. We used to go play in the ruins. There were still some remnants of the basement that you could see up on the top of the hill. Little did we know how big the house was. Nobody ever really showed us how big that house was. There's a wonderful history of Sorrento written back in the 1990s by Catherine O'Clair Person, and she talks about this cottage on Doane's Point. And she refers to it as the Rollins cottage. It was built by the land company. It was a hotel owned by Colonel Charles Lewis. It was located on Doane's Point, called the Clubhouse. It had a huge wharf in front of it, but it, for some reason, had difficulty attracting patrons. It sat empty for many years, and it was known as the Haunted House. It was vandalized and then torn down, and wood from this building was used to build Edgar Perry's house. Well, Catherine did a great job in detailing lots of history, but she left us more mysteries that needed to be solved. And so I sort of went down the rabbit hole trying to figure out what parts of this were correct, what parts of this little history that she gave were incorrect. And but she also raised lots of questions. So hopefully I can clear up a few of those for you tonight, since I've done all the research. And if anybody sees anything that I've gotten wrong or wants to add anything, I've got an email attached to my blog. Feel free to email me, correct me, tell me more stories. I'm eager to learn. So let's go back and look more closely at the history of Doane's Point. This is the 1903, referred to as the Peters Survey. Peters was a surveyor. He did lots of surveying in the area of down East Maine. There's Peters surveys over in MDI. But the Peters survey clarified the property lines on Waukeag Neck, and it shows up on the western end what we now refer to as Bean Point, and that was 121 acres that was owned by James Bean. And then coming down the coast by the harbor, we had the Preble acreage, then the Joseph Bragdon acreage. Then we have, of course, Daniel Sullivan. Daniel Sullivan, of course, was Captain Sullivan, who was captured by the British. And next to Daniel Sullivan was John Bean. Well, this says nothing about Doane. Doane, I couldn't find a Doane in this era, the 1803 era. I believe James and John Bean were brothers. If I'm wrong, somebody hopefully will correct me. But more importantly, John Bean, the owner of what is now Doane's Point, his daughter was Abigail. And Abigail married Daniel Sullivan in 1865. And in February 1871, when the British captured Captain Sullivan, they burned not only his house, but they also burned the Bean homestead as well on Doane's Point. So the question was, if in 1803 the point was not owned by John Bean, where did the name Doane come from? Well, after a bit of digging, what I was able to locate was the 1859 deed that finally solved for me who Doane was and the direct link to the John Bean land. What this deed is the Bean from Mary Bean. Mary Bean is indicated in this deed as a single woman. It was 86 acres, identified as lot number 5. And if you go back to that map that I showed you, lot number 5 was the John Bean land. And it was sold to Sophia Doane, the wife of Elijah Doane, by Mary Bean in 1859 for $900. And the sale also included what was then known as Seward's Island, which is now Treasure Island, but excluded the lots that included the family burying ground. There was a lot of history. I won't go into the history of Seward's Island and what the Beans did, but right now I think I may talk about that in a bit. So knowing that the Bean family sold the point to the Doanes in 1859, I wanted to learn more about the Doanes and their connection to Sullivan. In my research on another part of Sorrento, I found a connection between the Doanes and Charles Elliot, the president of Harvard College. During the 1870s, Charles Elliot spent several summers camping on Calf Island. And this is a picture that was drawn actually by his son, Charles Elliot, the other Charles Elliot, of their Camp Sunshine that was on the meadow on Calf Island looking back to Mount Desert Island. And Elliot, during his time there, attempted to buy Calf Island. He was a chemist by training. Since gold had been discovered in the area, and especially on Treasure Island, the owner of Calf Island, who was John Stover at the time, thought he was being manipulated and the land stolen because maybe Elliot had found gold on his island. There's some confusion as to whether Elliot was trying to buy Calf Island or trying to buy one of the points of land. That will never be truly discovered what point of land he was trying to buy, but he attempted to buy land in this area. He failed and ended up a few years later instead decamping to Northeast Harbor, where he helped to establish Northeast Harbor. But several years later, Elliot was married and traveling in Europe with his new wife, and his son, Charles Elliot, who at the time was an undergraduate at Harvard, organized a group of his classmates to join him for the summer of 1880, camping on Mount Desert Island, exploring nature. They did scientific research and generally just doing what college kids do, getting into trouble and having a good time. They named their group the Champlain Society after Samuel Champlain. And an interesting story from that time is the following summer in 1881, they chartered the Elliot family sloop called the Sunshine. And in addition to romping around the island and climbing mountains, they hired the boat and plied the waters of Frenchmans Bay and Penobscot. They also enlisted the help of a local Sullivan young man named Orrin Donnell to help run the boat. We have lots of connections to the Donnells in Sullivan, in Franklin. The Donnells, of course, named Donald Pond in Franklin. But I've also located another Donnell who actually owned land, which was the former Captain Sullivan's land, right next to the Doanes. So I believe the Donnells were neighbors of the Doanes on Waukeag Neck at the time. The great thing about the Champlain Society is they kept incredible notes of their travels, their ship logs. There are detailed scientific notes that the boys kept. And in August of 1881, the Sunshine took a trip off of Calf Island and put out their anchor off of Doane's Point. The next morning at 6 a.m., and I'll read you from this log entry, when most of the cabin party were enjoying balmy sleep, Elliot was awakened by a boot coming alongside. Before he was fully awake, he heard Worcester, who was on the floor, remarking, "Good morning," in rather an astonished tone, and the tone was only too well accounted for. Elliot opened his eyes and saw a stout pair of boots with correspondingly bulky legs coming down the companionway. In a moment, Captain Doane's jovial face followed his lower limbs, and sitting on the ladder, he proceeded to divulge his errand. In a few minutes, it was arranged that the yacht should carry a lady guest of the Doanes over to Bar Harbor, and that Elliot would call at the house when the yacht was ready to sail. Accordingly, a lady, Mrs. Sawyer of Portland, was brought on board, and the yacht got underway around 9 o'clock. The run across the bay was performed quickly, the wind being a good breeze from the northeast and weather. So Elliot met Doane and evidently knew Doane quite well. As part of my research, what I later found out was the Doyle property was pretty well documented in this volume 2 of the Islands of Mid-Coast Maine. They do a great job. This was published probably early 80s, maybe late 70s, if I'd only found this book earlier. I was lucky enough to stumble across Captain Doane's obituary a few years ago from the Ellsworth American in 1889. What it details is Doane was born on Cranberry Island in 1818 and died in 1889 at 70 years old. When he was around 40, he retired from the sea and bought the land on Waukeag Point from the Beans. And for 25 years, Doanes would pursue, as related in the obituary, the peaceful pursuits of agriculture and a part of the time in porgy fishing until the general recognition that the attractions of Sorrento gave his farm a boon. It went on to extol the character of Doane. To him, right was right, through the whole world might deny it, though the whole world might deny it, and wrong was wrong. So after their sale, the Doanes took their windfall and purchased land in Gouldsboro. Unfortunately, Captain Doane died just a few years later after they left Waukeag Neck, but his wife lived for a few more years after that. Today, Elijah and Sophia are buried in Steuben. So that's a little history on the Doanes. Let me just give you a little bit of a background on what was happening in the area in the late 1880s. So more and more tourists were coming to the area. The Maine Central Railroad built a huge wharf in Mount Desert Ferry that was opened in 1884. An express train would now run from Bangor down to Hancock. Hancock Point was laid out in plots in 1883. Development in Bar Harbor was going full steam. Hotels were full. And you could now, instead of taking a steamer up the coast, and change at Rockland for a little coastal steamer. You could just take the train from Boston. The trip was much more comfortable, much faster. In 1885, the Long Pond Water Company was established. This was started by 3 local Sullivan men, John Schoenbar, Charles Simpson, and Stan Wilson. Simpson and Wilson were brothers-in-laws. Wilson was married to Simpson's sister. In 1885, a new land company was organized, the Frenchmans Bay and Mount Desert Land and Water Company. And this was started by 2 brothers, Charles and William Lewis, both local fellows. They grew up in Bangor, made good. One ended up in Boston, one in New York. And our same friend, John Schoenbar, who was part of the water company. So Schoenbar and the Lewis brothers. Their first property was the Theaukee House. And the Theaukee House, I've got a whole history of the Theaukee House on the blog. It is basically where Dunbar's is. And the Theaukee House was built by 2 local Sullivan brothers, the White brothers. And it was used extensively during the mining era. But then afterwards, John Schoenbar purchased the hotel. And then when he started the land company with the Lewis brothers, they ran the hotel in Sullivan Harbor. So this sits at the head of Sullivan Harbor. By February 1886, the first purchase was then negotiated for land that would become Sorrento. Charles Lewis negotiated the first purchase, and it was the Doane family land on the eastern side of Waukee Neck. And it cost Lewis $4,000. And the deed also indicated that the Doanes could stay on the land for some period of time. And they actually renegotiated the land for an additional stay until they could find new places to go. So who was Charles Lewis? Charles Lewis is one of the more interesting fellows. He was the real force behind the founding of Sorrento, not Frank Jones. Frank Jones I'll get to in a minute. He was, again, a native of Bangor. He was a Civil War veteran, a colonel. He had been a stockbroker in New York City, working with Jay Gould, the infamous stock trader. He eventually lost his ability to trade stocks in New York City. He backed several silver mining operations in Sullivan. He even started a patent medicine with Thomas Edison. He had several other investments in the area. He had a land company in Stockton Springs at the head of the Penobscot River called the Cape Jellison Land Company. I don't know if I think that pretty much went bust. If you notice at the bottom, it says President Charles Hildreth. He rescued his college, which is called Norwich University, which is a military school in Vermont. And they renamed the college Lewis University. He then had some financial problems and they promptly changed the name back to Norwich University. But Sorrento was his vision and he was really responsible. His names were on all the deeds and negotiated the purchase of the land. He designed it and did all the promotions. And another story that I won't get into today, but he even was responsible for the name of the resort. Lewis and Schoenbar were first associated with Sullivan due to the mining companies. This is an 1882 directory of Sullivan. And what we see highlighted here is the Milton Mining Company, which was located on the Sullivan River, one of the many mines along the Sullivan River. Lewis and Schoenbar was the superintendent and Lewis was the owner of it. The other person you see there next to the red arrow, W.O. Arnold of Bangor. W.O. Arnold built the house, which today is the Stephen King House in Bangor. He was a broker, insurance guy. If you're interested in more of the mining history, the Historical Society has lots of information on mining, but I've done a bunch of writings on the blog as well. So in May of 1886 was the next purchase. Lewis then negotiated the purchase of Bean Point, which is the area of Sorrento next to the harbor that we all associate with Sorrento. But that was actually the second bit of land that he bought, the first one being Doane's Point. Earlier in that spring, the Bar Harbor Record announced that Lewis had actually purchased the Bean Point land from another Boston capitalist named William Hill Jr. And William Hill had first bought Bean Point from the Bean family. He was the president of the Boston and Bangor Steamship Company. And my supposition is he expected to develop Sorrento first, as you know, it would not have been called Sorrento. He would have called it something else. And he wanted to have his steamship operations there. Lewis came in and overbid. He ended up paying $50,000 for land that Hill had originally purchased for $4,000 just a few years earlier. Just want to really quickly talk about this bird's eye view. This is a colorized version of the bird's eye, and I'll post in a little while about this new bird's eye. This was just posted. You can find it online, but it's the black and white original art version of the 1888 promotional poster of Sorrento, and you can zoom in on it. This is a zoom in of Doane's Point. And what we can see is some of this may be artistic license. I don't know if it's all of it is true, but there's a wharf on the end. You can see a farmstead along the water, and up on the hill we can see a house. Very quickly, by 1887, Lewis had also negotiated not only the Theaukee House and some land in Sorrento, but also hunting grounds and fishing grounds up by Tunk Lake. That was going to be part of the attraction of Sorrento. And in comes Frank Jones. I can't do an extensive history of Frank Jones, but Frank Jones was probably one of the most powerful men, not only in New England, but in the United States at the time. He owned a brewery, but the brewery was just part of his power. He owned hotels in Portsmouth. He sat in Congress in 1877. He ran unsuccessfully for governor of New Hampshire in 1880. And he was just, you know, a powerful politician of his time. He also owned the Boston and Maine Railroad and was involved in railroad wars in New England, and eventually, you know, with all sorts of battles with the Vanderbilts for railroad rights throughout the United States. But he was a very powerful guy. He eventually sold his brewery to English investors and cleared, at the time, 1889, $6 million, which, you know, was probably, you know, $500 million or something. This is just for fun. Gary sent me this picture several years ago. This is the Jones house on Bean Point. It's out front. You can see his urns. He had electric lights installed in the urns, and people would drive for miles around just to see the electric lights in the urns. So back to Doane's Point. In 1888, news of construction on Doane's Point was reported in the Bar Harbor Record. Doane's Point, the easterly portion of the peninsula, the most beautiful place. The land is high, well wooded, and a view of the bay, magnificent. It also goes on to say, this charming location, Colonel Charles Lewis, of the president of the land company, has built a house because it is now almost ready for occupancy. No prettier spot for a house could be found on the whole property. So that's when the house on the hill was constructed during the summer of 1888. Jones was still president. Lewis was still president of the land company. By the following summer, Charles Lewis and his family are living in Doane Hill, their name for the house. It says Lewis and family. Lewis's wife died a couple years before he founded Sorrento, and he was left with, I think, 4 or 5 children, some as young as, I think, around 6 or 7. In 1889, things were going pretty well for Lewis. He'd established Sorrento, and then he had purchased land on Mount Desert Island and started another company there called the Mount Desert and Eastern Shore Land Company. And he was going to start developing land around Jordan Pond. By this following spring, 1890, Lewis was out as president of the Frenchmans Bay Land Company, and Frank Jones had taken over. Whether this was because the new company Lewis had started in Mount Desert Island, or for some other reason, maybe he'd been bought out. It's unclear why Lewis was no longer president, but it's very clear at this point Frank Jones brought in new directors a couple years earlier, but it was really at this point that Lewis is out of the company. A couple years later is the next time we pick up anything about the Doane's Point house. And in 1892, in an edition of the Bar Harbor Record, it's reported that a Mrs. E.H. Rollins and family of New York are now staying in the Doane Hill house. No longer the Lewises. For those of you familiar with Sorrento, there are lots of familiar names on these cottages and names of families, and some unfamiliar names that at some point I'll go into as well. So by 1892, the cottage is now referred to as the Rollins Cottage. So the question is, who was Mrs. E.H. Rollins of the Rollins Cottage? This photograph comes from a promotional book published by the land company, which had to have been published during or shortly thereafter of the summer of 1892, when the Rollinses were listed in that Bar Harbor Record. It's not called the Lewis House, it's called the Rollins Cottage. So who was Mrs. Rollins? Mrs. Rollins was the widow of Edward Henry Rollins, the former U.S. Senator from New Hampshire. Rollins had died a few years earlier in 1889, so it's likely that Mrs. Rollins began her summer visits with her family to Sorrento only after his death. And it's interesting that Mrs. Rollins is identified in that piece as living in New York City, as I can only find that she lived in Boston, Concord, New Hampshire, and Dover, New Hampshire. The reporting at the time, who knows who gave what to the reporters or the newspaper. More importantly, Rollins was also a financier. He was the president of the Boston, Concord, Montreal Railroad. He was the founder of the First National Bank of Concord, New Hampshire, as well as his own banking house, the E.H. Rollins Sons of Boston. He served also as a senator in the famous year 1877. For those of you who follow history, 1877 is a seminal year in presidential elections. Frank Jones also served in Congress that year as a Democrat. That history is another fascinating rabbit hole to go down that I won't do tonight. So the following summer, 1893, Mrs. Rollins passed away. Her times in Sorrento were very short. It seems only 1 or 2 summers. She died of dysentery in October 1893 at the age of 67 in York Harbor. The following August, the estate put the house on Doane's Point up for auction. This is in August 1894 advertising announcing the auction by order of a Boston attorney named William Ropes Trask. The public notice describes the beautiful summer residence from the estate of Senator E.H. Rollins of New Hampshire as a 12-bedroom cottage with broad verandas with a 3/4 of a mile from the main steamship landing in Sorrento Harbor, with a house located on a lot of nearly an acre with frontages on 3 broad streets. The situation is a very commanding one, having an elevation above all the surrounding lands. What I believe likely happened is that Frank Jones stepped in and either won that auction or pulled it off the auction and bought the land from the Rollins family. A little more on Frank Jones, and this will be another part of the history at some point. Jones was at the peak of his power at this point in the mid-1890s. Sorrento was coming into its own with visits by President Cleveland and senators and the Vice President of the United States, the Chief Justice of the United States. Jones really sold this place as a place for his buddies from Washington. Lots of Democratic power brokers from Washington came to Sorrento in the mid-1890s. And by 1895, Jones led the separation of Sorrento from Sullivan. I'll get into more details of that at some point in another history. Frank Jones dies in 1902, and he had a very complicated estate, complicated by lots of business interests. His estate had to get rid of and divest itself of. He was also sued by his girlfriend for $500,000 for services rendered. That also includes a story about a Sorrento house. But the estate was eventually sold to several real estate ventures, and I just posted the interesting story of the 1927 land auction and the story of John Nail, the African-American real estate broker from New York City who tried to buy the land and establish a summer resort for African-Americans in the 1920s. He was not successful in that purchase. The auction went ahead, but nobody picked up the option to buy Sorrento. The land where the big hotel on the harbor, that had been sold to several Boston gentlemen in 1906, and then several months later burned to the ground. But the rest of the Jones holdings, which were about 600 acres on the end of Waukeag Neck, what is now Sorrento, were sold to a gentleman named George Grant of Ellsworth. And Grant undertook trying to market the resort and sell land for many years. He took several partners. The last of these partners was the Charles Mann Realty Company of New York. They had all sorts of schemes, which were really interesting schemes to sell land. They weren't successful. So in 1927, they hired an auction company in New York City to conduct the auction of their holdings. And the Doane's Point Cottage was included in that land auction. They referred to it as the clubhouse. And that, and along with several other cottages, were not sold at the time. And eventually, I think probably not until the late 1930s or mid 1940s did a subsequent owner named Merritt Ober from Northeast Harbor. Merritt Ober eventually sold larger holdings to some of the families in Sorrento. And but that didn't happen at the 1927 auction. That happened much later, probably around the 1940s after the Depression. So what was the name? How did this house get the name the Clubhouse? That's another interesting story. It's caused some confusion. Some people have told me that they thought the name the Clubhouse originated from what was originally an old golf links that was where the Ewing Fields are now, if you're familiar with Sorrento. But this was nowhere near the Ewing Fields, and the golf link certainly didn't stretch, nearly half a mile down to Doane's Point. So I don't think, my feeling is the Doane Cottage was not named to be a clubhouse named after a clubhouse for golf links. What I tend to think happened was that it was used by the local town or the local owners as a meeting place. On the left, you'll see an article from 1904 where there's something called the Order of the Foresters in Sorrento, and they're going to be holding their session at the Hollywood Inn Club instead of the Doane Cottage, as they started to do in the beginning of their good work. And that brings up a whole nother interesting story about Sorrento. What the heck was the Hollywood Inn Club? Well, the Hollywood Inn Club was started by the Cochrans. Mrs. Cochran, who owned Tasseltop and was one of the early cottagers in Sorrento. She and Bishop Freeman, who was the minister at the church in Sorrento, started actually the Hollywood Club in Yonkers, New York. And the Cochrans owned a factory in Yonkers, and they started this club, which was almost like a YMCA, where the folks from town could hang out, play cards, do other things. And it looks like they started something very similar in Sorrento, in what we now call the Captain's House, which the Cochrans had purchased from the Jones estate when the Jones estate was liquidated. And this was a place where they set it up so that residents of Sorrento, not summer residents, but full-time residents of Sorrento could have a place to congregate and meet. They could play games, meet, and do other things at the Hollywood Club. So now we get into my very last bit, which is why did the little bit of land next to where my parents' house cottage was built, why was that not included in the 1927 land auction? Well, I think I solved that one also. That little plot of land, 1 acre of land, was owned by a gentleman from Bar Harbor named Colonel Edward Morrell. Colonel Morrell owned a large home in Bar Harbor called Thurlestane. He built a horse track named Robin Hood Park, which is today where Jackson Labs is. They donated that to Jackson Labs. More importantly, Morrell was married to a woman who was a member of the Drexel family, and her sister was the second American saint. Mother Drexel was she did many good works, started all sorts of orphanages, schools for Native Americans and African Americans around the country. And Colonel Morrell also bought Calf Island. And so he probably owned the pier that stood on the end of Doane's Point, and with that, the 1 acre of land. The other really interesting thing about Sorrento in the early 1900s, and this is a history that needs to be discovered, is at the turn of the century, automobiles were barred on Mount Desert Island. You could not bring a car on Mount Desert Island, only horses. But guess where your automobile was welcomed? It was welcomed in Sorrento. And I just have a gut feeling that this guy Morel, who had large estates, horses, boats, servants, he probably had an automobile that he couldn't drive in Bar Harbor, and maybe shipped his car over to Sorrento and used the roads. Sorrento was known for its roads, and this ad from 1908, George Grant, the owner at the time, was catering to folks from Bar Harbor who couldn't drive their cars there. So with that, that's the end of my little presentation on Doane's Point. This is a view from the point. And with that, any questions I'll be happy to take.